Welcome, Ken. Welcome to TOI Bookmark.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be on the show.
Our pleasure entirely. In fact, thank you for writing on the Stonehenge. It's one of my most favorite spots in the world. I love it dearly. And the origin story that you have created in this is never going to leave me. It's so brilliant. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad you liked it.
Loved it. So, shall we start at the beginning? What
Of
was the
course.
genesis of this book? How many years was it in the making?
Well, I've known about Stonehenge more or less all my life, and I visited it as a child. But what kicked off this book? I saw the title of an archaeological book, and the title was How to Build Stonehenge. Now, that's kind of a jokey title. It's like, there are lots of books called How to Get a Girlfriend and How to Mend Your Ford and so on. And of course, it's not a how-to book at all. It's an archaeological book. That was amusing. But what really struck me about that title was building Stonehenge. That sounds like a Ken Follett book. And so I looked into it. Now, uh, very little is known about Stonehenge. Indeed, very little is known about the Stone Age altogether. But as I looked into it, there were certain things about the building of Stonehenge which you couldn't call them facts, but let's say things that historians were generally agreed upon, and then certain things that are still mysteries. And so for me, it was a matter of researching what is known and then using my imagination to build on that, to speculate how the rest of it might have been done.
It comes together so beautifully
Thank you.
because it comes together. You're known for your multicast characters and these dramas. They're so full of life. They're so full of things. But in this one, the way you work with all these characters in these different communities spread across this great plain. I mean, to come up with that, did you find sort of uh, details in recent archaeological finds and discoveries or something which sort of got you thinking along this track?
Well, it's certainly true that in Britain at the time Stonehenge was built, there were three different types of community. There were farmers, herders, and hunter gatherers, the three different types. And looking at Salisbury Plain, I thought it was quite possible that that all three could have been represented in that neighbourhood. Quite plausible. The plain itself, Salisbury Plain, is not good for farming, and even today, with modern agricultural methods, there are very few farms on Salisbury Plain. It's because the soil is quite shallow. There's a shallow level of soil, and underneath it's rock, it's chalk rock, and you can't farm that, but it grows grass and the kind of shrubs that cows like to eat. So it's perfectly good territory for grazing a herd. So it seemed to me likely, and once again, this isn't a fact. It's just a deduction that I've made from what are the known facts, which is the geology of Salisbury Plain. It's not a fact, but it's a very sort of likely deduction from the facts. Now, on the edges of Salisbury Plain, there are rivers. On three sides of the plain, there are rivers, and in the river valleys, the soil is much better. So it seemed to me quite plausible that there would have been farms in the river valleys. And finally, there are still today quite large patches of woodland on Salisbury Plain, and that might well have been home to hunter gatherers. And so it was perfectly reasonable for me to have all three types within the general neighborhood of Stonehenge. And I thought, first of all, it seemed interesting to me to have these. But, so for example, the hunter gatherers would not even have spoken the same language as the herders and the farmers. The herders and the farmers probably did speak the same language because we don't know anything at all about their language.
No.
There are no records.
Yeah.
And there was, in this part of the world, in Western Europe, reading and writing were not known in the Stone Age. In other parts of the world, further east, in the east, writing was being invented, but not in Western Europe. So there are no written records. So we don't even know what their names were in the Stone Age. And so in Circle of Days, I had to just make up names. And, I couldn't call these people, John and Richard and Sandra, because that would have been funny, wouldn't it? Such Stone Age people to have modern names. So I thought, well, I've just got to make up words that sound as if they might be names, but aren't actually names. And so Seft is one of the main characters, and Joya is another of the characters. And I've used all these words that aren't quite names, but sound as though they might have been. Anyway, to go back to the three communities, I did that because I thought it was perfectly possible, and B, it was interesting. There has to be conflict in a novel, doesn't
Yes.
there? If everybody's happy, everybody's happily married, everybody loves their neighbors, that's great, but there's no story. So there has to be trouble. And I thought we could, as well as it being interesting to have different kinds of community, it would also create some tension that would be part of the story.
Well, tension is putting it mildly. There was
Yes.
more than a bit of friction which came into the seemingly calm cohabitation of these communities. You put in a wee bit about their origin as well, about ultimately they all came from one particular set of group of people, but diversified as their trades or their interests took them to
Yes.
different paths. Isn't that
Yes.
what that I suppose too is also based on your powers of deduction?
Well, um, the kind of the kind of lifestyle is not quite the word I'm looking for, but the kind of rules that people have about things like marriage and children, and sharing or not sharing, these things depend on how people make their living. And you see, farmers are very big on private property. The farmer says, "This is my field. These are my chickens. These are my goats. My goats." Now, the herdsman can't do that because they have too many beasts. So on Salisbury Plain, there would have been about 2,000 cattle. And I thought about this a lot, and I thought it's really not possible for them to keep track of which cow belongs to which villager. If it was a smaller number, it might be possible. And today, of course, cattle may be branded with a hot iron, with a symbol that shows who owns the beast. And with sheep, farmers sometimes paint a symbol on the sheep's fleece
Yes.
to show who it belongs to. In the Stone Age, they didn't have irons, so they couldn't have branded them, and they didn't have paint, so they couldn't have painted a symbol. And I thought about this, and I thought, no, they have to own these herds communally. So for the herdsman, private property will not be a big thing. For the farmers, it is a big thing. For the herdsman, not so much. And that would mean quite different lifestyles. Herdsmen, if their wealth is in the cattle, but that's communally owned. So their wealth is communal. They eat the cattle. So food is communally owned. Nobody has their own food because it all comes from the same herd. So they must have had a sort of ethic of sharing. That must have been normal to them. And the farmers would have been the opposite. They would not have been great sharers. They would have been people who said, "This bit belongs to me." So, though that's why the two communities have very different styles of life, and the hunter-gatherers again would be different again, because hunter-gatherers live, from hand to mouth. They gather nuts and fruits in the trees, and they occasionally catch a fish or kill a bear. There is a scene in my book, which you will remember, where
Yes.
they hunt. There's a scene of a bear hunt, which is
Yes.
very exciting, and so there are three different lifestyles in this in this neighborhood of Stonehenge. And that, I thought that was quite good because it gave you a picture, really, of all of Western Europe was like that at the time. It had those three different types of people making their living in three different ways.
Absolutely. And you also, the descriptions that you have, the detailed descriptions, whether it is of carving the flint or making the honeysuckle vine or even moving the Sarsen stones, I kept wondering if you had actually merely thought it through or made models or dioramas or something, because the descriptions are almost as if you can see the mechanics happen.
Well, once again, that's a mixture of known facts and my imagination. We do know about flints because we still
Yeah.
find them.
Yeah.
And on my desk, I have this. I was given this by an archaeologist. This is a Neolithic hand axe, and it's flint. Flint is a very hard stone, but it can be sharpened. And this is a cutting edge, and it can be sharpened and resharpened. It's a great skill sharpening flints. It's called knapping, flint
Yes.
knapping, and it means getting hold. You have to take another stone. This isn't a stone. This is my mouse, but never mind. You have to take another stone and you hit it like that,
Yeah.
and flakes fall off, and the result is a sharper. Now this is flint is very important because this was the only cutting tool that they had. It's the Stone Age, so there's no metal. There are no knives.
Yeah.
Anything. Only stone was virtually their only tool. Um, so a lot of what I've written, I've had to imagine them doing an awful lot with flints. Of course, if you wanted to carve a joint of meat, you'd use one of these. And if you wanted to chop a tree down, you just have a bigger one of these. But that must have taken them a long time, don't you think? Just with this stuff, you can see me running my finger down it. It's not cutting my finger, but it's not a very sharp. So it's not a
Yeah.
very sharp edge. So it would have been. I mean, it must have taken to chop down a big oak tree for really hard wood. It must have taken days and days of doing this, and it would have become blunt, and it'd have to be sharpened. You probably would have 10 people around the tree all doing this to chop the tree down. So, so, um, but based on something like this, archaeologists dig these up all the time. And I mean, there are flint is everywhere, but this has quite clearly been made into a tool. You don't find if you find flint, you don't on the ground. You don't find it like this. Doesn't look like this. Just looks like stones, and they have to be very carefully shaped. This fits. See how nicely this fits into my
Yeah.
hand,
Yeah. So you
and
can actually use it.
so we have some evidence. Uh, the only evidence we have to, basically, is what the archaeologists dig up, and tools are one of the things that they dig up. The other things they used in at this time, and they must have used them a lot when they were building Stonehenge. There's one other thing that is hard and can have a bit of a point, and that's the antler of a deer.
Yeah.
And archaeologists find those all around mines and places where houses were built. And the flint, the if you hold a deer's antler, it feels actually like very hard china. Feels like china, but it's very very hard. And so they used antlers to dig. So they would loosen the ground with the antler, you see, and then they would have a wooden shovel to dig up the loose earth. And this kind of thing that the archaeologists find gives us clues, and then we have to you get one of these. Okay, that's real. That's not made up. That's not imagined by me. But what's imagined by me is somebody with this in his hand or her hand, and what they're doing with it and how they use it to chop down a tree.
Those descriptions are incredible. I mean, there's so much in your book. I couldn't put it down. I couldn't
Good.
put it down. But the other thing which stands out, and there is a lot which stands out, of course, is your sense of music in the story. It is incredible. I mean, it's not just in the songs of the priestesses or the laments for the dead, the lullabies and ditties for the toddlers, the risk song of the revelers. It's also in the rhythm of your writing. It sort of
Huh.
infuses the text, so much so that sometimes I found that the rhythmic repetition of the relationships that you kept bringing in was almost like in the oral narrative being put down in the written word. It was incredible. It
Thank
was,
you.
yeah,
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
absolutely.
And of course, what the the earliest stories that we know about, at least in Western literature, are the works of Homer and a long poem called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now these are poems that tell stories, and they're the oldest stories that we know. But before they were ever written down, most people think they were remembered in long poems. But what historians think, that there were poets who would learn these off by heart and remember them. So when they were telling a story, they would actually repeat this poem that they had learned, and it could be very long. I mean, it could take an hour or more, but it would be an exciting story. So you have to imagine these people, and of course, we always imagine them sitting around a fire, because it's really nice to tell a story sitting around a fire. You imagine them sitting and listening to this poet tell about Gilgamesh, for example, was a giant, and he's and in all these old stories there are gods who interfere in the lives of human beings, which is very exciting, because gods, of course, have magical powers. And so it seems very likely that in the Stone Age there would have been poems. The other thing about these poems is that, as well as being entertainment, they often passed down information,
Yeah,
and because it couldn't be written down. So if you wanted something to be remembered for generations to come, for example, all early civilizations study the sun and the moon, the movements of the sun and the moon, and they're regular. So supposing you want to now, today, somebody who was studying would write down the daily movements of the sun and the moon over the course of years and keep track of them. They couldn't do this, but what they could do perhaps is, when they understood these things, they could make up a poem about them. And it might be a poem about the sun god.
yeah.
The sun god wakes up in the morning, and he or she looks at the world and says, "Well, the east is all right. I think I'll go and have a look at the west." That would be the kind of thing. And so these would have been very important for civilization. And of course, I've imagined. We know that people studied the movements, the heavens, the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars. So I've imagined that in order to pass this knowledge down, they would have had songs and dances that would have taught later generations what they had found out. Now, that I keep saying this, but I must, because this is something that I've imagined based on something that we know, but it is a guess.
you know I have to tell you, one of the comments I wrote to myself in the margin of your book was that your story kept reminding was like the idea of remembering through music is so much like oral storytelling. And now, even in the written word of long novels, where you have to remember what happened in the first half to carry it over to the second, it's
Yes, true.
incredible.
That's true. That's true.
I
Well,
actually
if it's vivid enough, we remember. I mean, the bits of a book that we forget are the less interesting bits. The big dramatic scenes and so on are what we remember, if it's good, if it's well written.
Well, come on, your ferocious energy in writing this text. Oh my goodness me. There were those descriptions of the cattle stampede, I mean, even the horrific ones, the massacre of the young and the old, the lynching, the murder, the romantic love, or the sexual violence, or simply observing the priestesses dance on the monument, on the mound. I mean, each episode had the ferocity and was, it was impossible to put the book down. How many of these incidents? I know you keep saying that you used a deduction pass, but sometimes when it comes to especially the incidents of violence, I kept wondering whether they could be, they were based on some documented stuff, because it seemed like that. The horror
Um,
of it all.
well, I mean, you're right. Some is made up. Some has is inspired by things that I've read, or might even be things that I've seen. Um, the bear hunt, uh, which obviously, if there was a bear hunt today, it would be completely different. But I read a novel, an American novel, which was set in towards the end of the 19th century, um, and there was a very vivid description of a bear hunt. Um, before there were things like radio and radar and so on, where it was just people following the tracks of a bear and being quite and intending to catch up with the bear, but being quite scared of what would happen when they did catch up with him. And so I based a lot of the sort of lore about the woodland lore. Most of that I got from articles and stories about people who lived in the woods, about hunter gatherers, but also people living relatively primitive lives, as farmers or herders in the 19th century, without any modern, luxury, without any modern aids. So, I mean, I use everything I can. If I can find stuff. There's a moment in this book where they find a nest, a bee's nest, and of course, yum yum, honey. But they have to separate the bees from the nest, otherwise they'll be stung to death. And there is a way of doing that, and I got that from a book I was reading about how it would have been done hundreds of years ago. And I thought, okay, well, that's something that doesn't change. How do you get the honeycomb out of a bee's nest without being stung to death? Okay, there's a way of doing that has been around for thousands of years, and I managed to find out how it was done, and based my account. I mean, I made it. It's quite a personal thing because it's a man sort of partly teaching a young person
Yeah.
how this is done. That that was my addition, and I'm sorry. So I should have silenced my phone. I'm sorry. So anyway, yes, if I can find anything that gives me some information about how these things are done, then I will use all the information I can get, and then of course, then we see the thing from inside the mind of one of the characters. So it's also that character's take on it, which makes it unique.
That it is. That's a very small part of the book, and it's very beautifully done. It's very beautifully done, and but that's exactly what I mean. Whether it is the collecting the honey, getting the honeycomb out of the beehive, to even the horrific incidents that we listed earlier, there is a kind of it's impossible to tear yourself away from the page, because it's not just relevant to the story, but it makes you think about how what seemed like a calm and calm community, or three communities coexisting, how how much violence can be unleashed at the drop of a hat, and the idea of revenge, hatred, which can coexist simultaneously with the idea of the different kinds of love. It's, and it's all considered natural. I mean, this that you don't question the coexistence of these emotions, these facts.
Well, I think it's true, and this is a very sad fact about the human race. There has always been war. It's all through. So, some people kind of have a fantasy that before civilization, when everybody just lived in the woods, then there was no war and people lived in peace. But we know now that that's not true, because the archaeologists find places where there are 1,000 arrowheads. Arrowheads were made of flint, so they don't deteriorate. They're still in the ground where they went when they were used. And so, if they find 1,000 arrowheads, how could there be 1,000 arrowheads in the same place? It can't even have been a hunting party, because they wouldn't have 1,000 arrowheads. If there are 1,000 arrowheads, then it must have been a battle. And these sites with the evidence of battle are go back beyond the beginning of civilization, back to the age of the hunter gatherer. The other thing is, the archaeologists dig up the bones of people who died maybe 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, before there were towns and governments and so on. And you can tell if there's a broken bone, they can tell. There are different kinds of ways that a bone breaks. And if a man falls out of the tree and breaks his leg, it's a different kind of break from if somebody hits his leg with a stone and smashes it. Those You can tell. I couldn't tell, and quite possibly you couldn't tell, but they can tell what kind of a break it is. And of course, if there are many skeletons in a place where the bones have been smashed by being with stones, then they know that all of those people died of violence.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, these sites where there were battles, big battles and small battles, are everywhere. We human beings were never a peaceful people. It's rather sad, actually. I wish the people investigating these things had found the opposite. But there we are.
Yeah, there we are. But and that's the thing, that you mention this and you bring it out, and sometimes it seems very real because we come across these accounts, if not parts of the world are experiencing it firsthand. So it seems very real, a kind of a, it's not even a resurrection of the Stone Age. It's just it's a narrative which is worth reflecting upon. In fact, did you I mean, is Circle of Days, do you think it is a slight departure from your previous books in any manner? I mean, do you think so?
No, it isn't really a departure. With every historical novel, there's a basis of fact, and the author then imagines other things with inspiration from those basic facts. And the only difference with the Stone Age is that the base of known facts is smaller, and
Hmm.
so the author's imagination does more work. But that's not a problem for me. If I had trouble imagining things, I wouldn't be an author.
That's true. But yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, true. It's historical fiction, it's multicast, it has a lot of dialogues, the fast pace, communication, a lot of incidents, some interconnected, some acting, I mean, operating on a parallel track, which will influence the main plot. But somehow, I mean, I correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my impression, that it turns out to be a very woman centric novel, not necessarily because of so many women players, but in the way, in your dialogues, in the nuanced, where even where the farming community, when Duff is finally made the big man, he corrects, he balances everything and says women will now be able to inherit property, etc. And the other thing is, um, of late, your books seemed, you have always had a female character who's brutally sexually assaulted, but in this, there are hints of the sexual violence. It's not up. It's not there. Is this some kind of a conscious decision, or is it an evolution of your authorial work? What is it? I mean, it's just something which struck me. Nothing else.
Um, well, like all of us, I'm getting older, and perhaps I'm a bit more gentle, and perhaps I don't want to write quite so much violence in my stories as I used to. Um, but your question about the role of women is interesting because when in early civilizations, when they study the heavens and the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars, this is the beginning of science in most
Yeah,
civilizations,
it is.
and it's usually done by priests. But we tend to assume that everything in history was done by men, and that's not so. Um, and let me give you an illustration of that. We used to believe that the cathedrals were built by men. And today, in today's civilization, most building work is done by men. The stones are heavy and so on, and people just assumed, well, that's the kind of work that men would do. And then a French historian called Jean Gampel discovered that this wasn't true, and in fact, a lot of women worked on the building of the cathedrals. And the way he found this out was he studied the tax records of the city of Paris, and while Notre Dame was being built, and he found that these records are in Latin, so you can tell the difference between male and female names. And he saw quite a lot of female names who were paying tax as glass makers,
Yeah,
mortar makers, and sometimes even stonemasons. And so he proved that women as well as men were involved in building the cathedrals. So to go back to the Stone Age, I decided that Stonehenge would be a kind of Stone Age university in which they studied and kept records of the movements of in movements up in the heavens. And my first thought, well, then the people who do this will be priests. And then I thought, wait a minute, they could be priestesses.
mm.
Might be a bit more reliable.
Well, you never
Anyway,
know.
um, so that, and I've done that a lot. I've given women more prominent roles in my books. I think it reflects real life
Yeah,
because women, even in times when the conventional wisdom is that men do all the important work and women can't do that, they're too emotional or they're too weak or whatever it is. But even in the Middle Ages, when the monks would write books saying women can't do this, women can't do that, and the guilds that ran the towns would say, well, no woman can be a tradesman in this town, no woman can own a business in this town. And then you look at what actually happened, and you found that there were many powerful women. There were abbesses.
yeah,
Now, a monastery, an abbey, can be run by an abbot, or if it's a nun's convent, it'll be run by an abbess. Many of these abbesses controlled enormous amounts of money, thousands of sheep, acres and acres of land, square miles of land, and they might have 50 nuns, but they would also have 100 employees.
yeah.
That's a big business, and it was often run by a woman. Let's take a countess. Now, the count would often be off fighting a war somewhere. Who ran the estate? Who collected the rents? Who decided, who ran the courtroom? It was his wife. It was the countess who did it when the count was away. So women once again were very powerful. There were famous queens in the Middle Ages. All through history, we find people pretended that women didn't do anything important and ignored the fact that women were doing quite a lot of important things. We also know it from English surnames. Often in the Middle Age, your second name was your job. So you would be, I might be Ken Baker or Ken Brewer or Ken Weber. Weber was a weaver. But if a woman had that job, her surname, these names have female versions. So a woman weaver was a Webster, a woman brewer was a Brewster, a woman baker was a Baxter. And these are surnames today in English.
Yes.
So the fact that these surnames are commonplace shows that women doing these jobs were commonplace.
Wow. Wow. Actually, there's a lot of information coming out in archaeology in the last decade or so. In economics and history, there's a lot of information, anthropology, etc. A lot of interesting new information by re-looking at evidence which already exists. So not going with preconceived notions of what it
E-
should be,
exactly.
you know? It's
Exactly. We have terrific preconceptions about the role of women just because, of the way our well, first of all, our society is structured in a certain way, but we're aware of it because our societies are changing.
exactly.
And it's this the fact that it's changing has made us all think about it.
Yes.
And so we look at history, we look at we look at history with a certain skepticism about what historians in, say, the 19th century would have completely ignored women in history if they could.
Yes.
And today we don't do that because the women of the 20th century and the 21st century said, wait a minute,
We
this
did.
doesn't make sense. And they were right.
No, they're right. Inherited narratives are being looked at, and
Yeah.
that is incredible. I mean, and that's exactly why I found your novel, The Circle of Days, as positioning itself not. Uh, it was just something which was so perfect with the kind of narratives which have been made visible, and you have done this sterling effort of making this visible. It doesn't matter if it's imagination, it's based on, as you say, a lot of logic, and it's very readable. I mean, so thank you for that. Thank you for that. And but before you go, I have to ask you a couple of things for the sake of the Indian audiences. Have you ever been tempted to write about India?
Um, I've often thought about it. I visited India, and I have Indian in-laws, and so I'm very aware of India. The trouble is, I mean, what I wouldn't want to write a book about the British in India. There are lots of books about that, and to me, it's a tired subject. Uh, and really, the role played by the British in India, many aspects of it are something that we can't be very proud of, and um, but of course the history of India. I mean, the history of India before the arrival of the East India Company might have been very interesting. So that would be a possibility for me. It would involve a lot of research, but that's part of the fun. So yeah, it's sort of on my list of maybes.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah,
That's really good to know. So I mean, obviously, because you've been writing for so long, are there any Indian authors that you follow? I don't know. I mean,
I
uh,
like I like Narayan. It's
yes,
V.K. Narayan,
yes,
isn't it?
argue.
And yes, I've read several of his novels. My favorite was The Financial Expert,
Ah,
about the guy who sat under a banyan
in
tree
tree. Yes,
outside the bank.
yes,
And he said, if you want a loan, you'll need this form and you can have it. I'll sell it to you for 1 rupee. Of course, when they got into the bank, they found that the forms were free,
yes,
but that
yes.
was too late then. And then he starts to take deposits and make loans. And it's a comic novel. It's very good. And he wrote a lot of, I don't know if he's even still alive. He wrote a lot of stories, all about the same, set in the same town in India. They were very good. And of
Malgudi.
course, I mean, there are many hugely talented authors of Indian descent in the West, particularly in the United States and in Britain. Some of our most interesting and most accomplished authors are of Indian descent.
Yes. So, well, I hope you do finally get down to writing that book or a novella. But thank you so much for being on TUI Bookmark. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you, Ken. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you. I enjoyed it too.